right, hi everybody. We are back. This is Creativity is the Cure. I'm your host, Malcolm Moore. Today I am broadcasting from Maestro Machination Studio in Palmdale, California. And today we have part 2 of one of my favorite guests, Alex Kelley. How are you doing today, Alex?
You seem to be okay.
I assume you are broadcasting from Rocheter, New York, as usual?
Yes. And, just same as it ever was.
Look where my hand was. Last time, we talked mainly about your guitar playing and music. And today I'd like to focus on the 2 topics we didn't get to. And that would be how do you use creativity as an educator and a photographer. So the first question, and let me clarify for everybody, you teach guitar, but you also teach photography, correct?
Yes. So, I've been teaching guitar since 1997. And I began teaching photography 2 years ago.
Okay, so let's start with educator. When did you become a guitar teacher?
So that was 1997. It was the sort of thing where an individual at a nearby music store called to say, hey, would you like to teach? And it was something where I was interested in doing that because I had read an article, one of the few interviews with Randy Rhoads before he died, where he spoke of how much he learned and improved himself by teaching. So that was appealing, but back then I didn't think I had anything to offer. Little did I realize that honestly my personality really is suited to me teaching because of just the way I'm inclined to seek out accurate information and whatnot. But I also, as I would say, I would attempt to. I've always attempted to be inclusive and not a gatekeeper because I feel like I grew up with gatekeepers when it came to the music education in my school district.
Yeah, and you were talking in our other interview about the difference between reacting and responding. Right.
I probably was.
Okay, so I've got to ask, I'm a music teacher out here in California, and I never planned on being a teacher, let alone being a music teacher. When I was younger, I had taught private lessons, but I remember a good friend of mine, I was her assistant teacher in the classroom, and this particular teacher had gotten sick, and she asked if I could take over for a couple days, and I'm like, no problem, this is easy. And I found it to be very difficult, even though I was teaching kindergartners. And so my question to you is, I found that teaching something is much more challenging than knowing something. What would your response to that be?
Yeah, it's the work in teaching is, like you're saying, you have to know it, you have to understand it, and then be able to offer it up to someone. And certainly in a private lesson, you're gearing it towards the person who you're sitting with, and depending on how long that person's coming in for lessons, the course of weeks, months, years, you certainly develop a relationship and understand how people work or think.
Right.
The difficult thing certainly is when it's sort of, hey, first lesson, you want to make sure you keep them, or that first month, are they going to make sure that they feel like they can do something? And the questions I would get from parents sort of, is my son at kindergarten old enough? And it really is. Yes, there is the manual dexterity of someone who's 5.
Right.
Can they push down a little skinny string? And but at the same time too, it really does come to the personality, and the work is adjusting yourself to be able to reach a multitude of personalities.
And I've got to interject and add that I know exactly what you mean, because I teach private drum lessons, and a lot of times they say, what age can you start? I've had drummers start at 4 years old that are intellectually ready, but the funny thing is they often can't, as they say, reach the pedals. So I've had to get little tiny drum sets. At my school, I teach a class called Rock Band, and I have, drums, bass, keys, guitar. But for some of the little guys, I have like a smaller size guitar and a smaller size bass. Have you ever had to employ that approach?
Well, yeah. At the store where I taught for years, you often have kids coming in with the scaled down instruments, and at a school where I've been for 10 years, a private school, I have a couple of ukulele students, one of whom has got basically a toy Spider-Man ukulele, which it's, because he was asking last Monday, is this a toy? And it's like, well, yeah, it is, but it still functions.
I teach ukulele too, and I run into the same problem, but a lot of times parents buy like a ukulele at Target, and I always say the rule is these strings have to be able to stay in tune. You probably deal with that too, right?
Yeah, I mean, the ukulele that I purchased years ago for myself, I've mentioned to people that in the first couple of years I had it, the strings always went flat, and then they reached a point where for a couple of years the strings I would pick up and they're sharp, and then for a few years the strings, they were just always in tune. Yeah. And I really admit the strings that are on it were the original strings because they're nylon, and I wash my hands 70 times a day, so it's not like I'm getting dirty. So in that fact, it's like, it's sort of, they're going to go out of tune. Well, as long as they don't go out of tune while I'm physically playing it, that's fine.
Yeah.
And it's good that you bring that up because I certainly work with what's in front of me, and that's another aspect of education that you, in the ideal sense, we have the studio and it's outfitted this way, and the parents have a consistent thing, but that's not the real world. People come in with what they have, and right. Can we get something going? And and that's something I know David Byrne was talking about in his book, How Music Works, speaking to the idea.
Great book.
Yeah, excellent, yeah. And I wound up reading the second version because he added stuff after he did a book tour. And certainly he...
I wonder which version I have. I'll have to talk to you about that later.
I assume you have the original, because I feel like that was out like 12 years ago.
I bought it late in the game, 3 years ago, so I have the orange copy. So I probably have pretty updated, but go on.
Yeah, the same one I got. But yeah, at that point, the technology does affect how we approach it as humans. And, it's just I would say the big trait for the teacher is being adaptable.
Absolutely. And can I ask you, out here in California, as an educator, one thing that is really big is having a constructivist approach. And all that means is if I get up and let's say I'm going to teach about the blues, before I tell what it is, I will ask the class, who knows what the blues is? Tell me anything you know, because you want to throw it into their court and find out how much they know, and also help them feel like they're in control of the learning. And it's not just like, when I don't know about your experience, but some music classes when I was younger, it was just like, this is the way it is, boom, 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 and we're all bored out of our mind.
Yeah, I did that last night, actually, in the photography class, where I last night began a sequence for a 5-week night photography class, and it was a decently attended class. Of course, this is adults. And I began basically by asking who people were and why they're there, basically. Because, you could assume that, they want to learn about taking photos in the dark, out and about at night. But at the same time, for me, it is a case of, specifically, what are you into? Because what you might be into that she's not into, and can we have it in principle? Can we have the overall information that as I say, the principle of it hits on everything that people individually want to do. So, and yes, exactly that, to make sure that people are already invested by saying, well, okay, gang, here's me and here's my story. So then I'll start bringing in stuff, because yes, if I just walked in and lectured straight on, it's kind of, just boredom.
Yeah, I think you want it to be interactive, and I think what's important to me, I'm sure this happens to you less, but, like many humans, I make mistakes once in a while, and I always tell the kids right away, if somebody corrects me, I'll be like, yeah, you're right, I made a mistake, thank you for reminding me about that. And I think if you humble yourselves with your students, they'll realize they don't think that you're a condescending, adult with folded arms and furrowed brow looking down upon them. Because in reality, with people like you and I that are this tall, when you work with little kids, you see a photo of yourself with them and you're like, man, I am a monster. Yeah. This person only comes up to like my hip.
Yeah, there was an instance probably around 99 or 2000 when at the store there, the music store way back, that I was getting a new student, and I guess walking up to the counter, the owner of the store mentioned later that the kid was his eyes went wide because I was taller than his father. So I didn't notice it, because I was I was looking at the overall, and here's the blah, blah, blah. So, because the kid was, during the lesson, he was very uninvolved and kind of didn't want to be there. So he was just kind of freaked out and intimidated, obviously. But Yeah, and that was early in my teaching, so I wasn't really as clued into that. But certainly, as I can say, here it is, 25-ish years later, being able to recognize and respond to that situation. That it's like, yeah, I mean, I'm more than willing and ready to say, to kind of have an apology of, in general, like if I did something or said something not, it's not malicious, but even if it's a case of, oh yeah, I said that wrong, or oh yeah, I forgot about that part, sorry, that kind of thing. It is just basically having a conversation, even if it's a tiny small human who's only been alive for 7 years, something like that. If I could throw one in yesterday, and I mentioned this earlier in an online meeting I was on, a guy I know in Oregon who's part of Guitar Crafts, he put a statement on his Instagram story that said, sometimes the mistakes are what makes the work great.
Yes.
Humanity breathes in mistakes. And I don't know the source of that, which I probably should contact him and say, hey, where'd you get that? Because that's
well, there's so many famous quotes that are similar to that. The one I see on social media all the time is the one when a very young Herbie Hancock was working with Miles Davis, and a lot of stress being up there with Tony Williams and Ron Carter and all these brilliant people. And at one point, I'm paraphrasing, but Herbie Hancock apparently hit the wrong chord, and then Miles paused for a minute and then made it work. He listened to the chord and played off of it, and the piece became a lot more interesting. And then it makes me think of when you and I are younger and playing all the time, there's all those basic band jokes, what do you do when you make a mistake, do it twice, and now it's a riff.
Yeah, I mean, that was someone was bringing that up earlier too, that you look at like the idea of Van de Graaff Generator having 30%, or a third of their show was excellent. A third of their show might have been a little garbage because they were stretching out, whereas other bands of the genre might have been a little more stable and inclined to say, well, we're going to be successful. And some band like, the Generator there, it's sort of, well, we're going to experiment, and some of it might sound really bad. But
you're making me think of Spinal Tap. I hope you enjoy our new direction.
Jazz Odyssey.
Jazz Odyssey, yes. So you made a comment before that leads into our next question. Now, I don't know, you kind of were saying that you try to find out what your students are into so you can get material to keep them engaged. You're reminding me of a great book. I think it's only audio. Have you checked out Elvis Costello's book called How to Play Guitar and Why?
I've never heard of that.
So I really like this book. Somebody recommended it to me, and I was listening while I was driving. And after a while, I was like, wow, this guy teaches guitar like I teach drums. And like you were saying, when you have a new student, you want to get their attention so they're not bored and leave. Like for a usual drum lesson, I might teach rudiments and then, independence of hands and legs, playing drum set patterns. But that might throw them off, especially if they're young, because it's really challenging. So right away, I'll be like, what band do you like? Do you like Imagine Dragons or the Beatles? And then I'll try to pick the most simple one. So the kid leaves the first lesson, having some kind of ownership, like, oh, I learned how to play this song. I mean, you could do, if it was a bass lesson, you could do Van Halen, Running with the Devil, because stay on this note. That's the sweet note.
You got it.
And furthermore, I also have with my middle students a choir, and although I would love to teach them something like Peter Gabriel, Mercy Street, or the Beatles, because there's incredible harmonies, that's not what they're listening to. So right away, I found out the two artists they were into is Charlie XCX and Chappell Roan. And so we arranged a choir thing, and they're in 1,000%. And at the end of the day, I want them to know about different composers, but I want them to be engaged. So we'll often put performances or lessons based around what the kids like today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I will say that there's a local music store who on their website would say, one of the things that makes us different from other people is that we govern our lessons to the person. It's like, no, that's literally every music store and everyone who teaches an instrument that I know of. I mean, I know there are, like in a college setting, university setting, you have a curriculum that certainly has some element of, it's got to be approved, like in New York, it's got to be approved by SUNY and whatnot. But,
right.
I mean, for doing what I'm doing or anything like that, whether it's on my own or in a private school, in a music store, and teaching up the street at the art center, I mean, at that point, it's up to the teacher to come up with a curriculum. And yeah, obviously, it only makes sense for someone to say, I have my personal curriculum that is an outline with some specific things that I can hit on and touch on that I know work with this subject matter.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, you want to make sure that the person does feel invested, like we were saying a little while ago. And it's the sort of thing where, I mean, I was asking that question going back to my earliest days of teaching guitar is, what do you listen to? Who do you listen to? And, back in the end of the 90s, beginning of this century, I would get a laundry list of bands that were usually topical. Like in 2001, kids would say like System of a Down and Creed. But by the time we hit 2012-ish, I usually, when I would say, what do you listen to? I would get anything, everything, Shoulder Shrug, stuff, country, rap, EDM. These are all answers that teenagers even gave me. People rarely had like a band name or. Well,
that's a great point. I'm glad you brought up. Like when I asked my students at the beginning of the year, like, what band do you like? I learned years ago. Most kids today, they'll like a song. They won't have a favorite artist other than Taylor Swift. They won't have a favorite album, stuff like that. They like just random songs here and there, and often they won't even get through the whole song.
They might not know the name of the song too, because I would say, hey,
all the time.
I mean, I could ask, such and such song, and they're like, no, and I play it on my phone. They're like, oh, I know that. Of course you do.
Yeah, that happens. That happens all the time. The Chapel Roan, they didn't know what it was, but they were like, "Can we do Good Luck, Babe?" I'm like, "Well, who is that? I don't know." So I said, "All right, let's ask the Spotify," and then we figure out who that is.
Yeah. What was that? There was that one song that was out. I can't remember when, maybe 2014 or 12. But some song that I remember one guy in a lesson was asked, saying, "Oh, I like this song," and he gave me, much like people would say of the Who. People would call Bob O'Reilly Teenage Wasteland.
Yeah.
So
I remember that when I was younger.
It was like, can we play whatever? And I'm just thinking. I came home and looked it up, and it's like, oh, that's a lyric into the song. The song is a different name. So it's like, that's the most he has. And that's another aspect of teaching is, like I say, in the adaptability, the necessity to be able to do your own research, because clearly the other person might not know how or might not want to. So, you have to be ready to say, I know what you're talking about. I found it.
Yeah, I really luck out, too, because our younger son, Caleb, who's 22, he often knows what's popular about 6 months before everybody else. So I often come into the new year going, all right, it's going to be Charlie XCX, it's going to be Olivia Rodrigo, it's going to be Chapel Roan. The other question I want to ask you, though, a lot of times when I ask the kids what they like, it might not be my cup of tea, but the more I learn the music, whether I'm teaching a class or a private drum lesson, sometimes I'm like, wow, this is actually pretty cool. A good example is Olivia Rodrigo, who I kind of liked right away. But when her song Bad Idea Right came out, it got to the guitar solo, and I flipped out because the guitar solo was so good. And I was like, is this Adrian Belew? And it wasn't. It was a younger guy. I can't remember. I wish I could remember his name now. Fantastic guitar playing, that was similar to what you and I grew up with and liked. So have you ever found that if a student brings you something you don't know, that eventually kind of turns you around, you start to appreciate it more because you're figuring out how to play it?
I'm actually trying to think of that, if that actually happened or not, because a lot of modern music, I think a lot of younger people who are into modern music in that passing fashion may or may not bring something in. In the last decade or so, I mean, I can remember one guy who probably graduated from one of the local schools maybe in 2019, and I taught him for a few months when he was a senior, and he was really into country music, and I'm still not into country music, and those songs were not for me. I know a couple of people were referencing Imagine Dragons. I'm still not a fan. So
understood, not for everybody, but one thing I got to say about them, whether you like them or not, they're great at making earworms that you can't get out of your head, which is not an easy task. And for a band like that to pull that off for more than a decade, that does take a lot of talent to make really catchy melodies. I could say that about Taylor Swift. You would not come home and hear me listening to her, but a lot of times I'm like, oh, this is actually pretty cool. Or when I taught concept albums, I got their attention by telling the kids, do you know that Taylor Swift did a concept album.
Right, and I know some of her fans like, oh, the song is 10 minutes long, and if you've been listening to Yes, Genesis, you're like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, we are guilty of liking songs that are a whole side of a record.
Yeah. I mean, I guess fortunately for me, I say fortunately in so much as me being a guitarist who would want to promote guitar music. Because obviously a lot of pop music that's current, there might be guitar on there, but it might be there for 8 measures in the chorus, or it's you know.
Well, you know, you're bringing me on so many different tangents, but I read an interview with Sting once. I know it was actually Branford Marsalis, who said, you know, when I'm playing jazz, we all do 4s, or we take a whole, 12 bars to do a solo. But when I got with Sting, he goes, Branford, you have 8 bars. That's it. If you can't figure out how to say what you got to say within 8 bars, then you don't know what you're doing.
Well, yeah, like a lot of this, any solos that did actually appear on Police songs, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important for pop music, but you're right. A lot of people like us, we might like some poppy stuff, but we also like stuff that takes it way out there, like Miles Davis' Bitches Brew, where they're just, everybody's going absolutely nuts.
Yeah, I mean, I like, there was one kid I was teaching last year who was really into Bowie. And I think he might be a senior this year at a private school just a little south of Rochester, and we spent a bit of time working on some of Stevie Ray Vaughan's parts, basically from some Bowie action, so
which can be kind of challenging.
Yeah.
And from what I've heard from most, guitar players that played with Bowie, like Earl Slick or Carlos Alomar or Adrian, from what I've read and heard, that he used some pretty unique chord changes that kept everybody interested. Yeah,
I mean, he obviously had a different approach than basically everyone else that Bowie would have worked with. I mean, going back to Mick Ronson and whatnot, definitely different from Fripp and Torn. And actually, I didn't realize it until I was walking last night, walking past the bop shop, and Tom was leaving that night, the owner of the bop shop in Rochester.
Great story.
And I told him how I stopped in, bought a one CD from the Matt Pavoka band who was here a couple weeks ago. And because Tom got an original or an early copy back in June, and he threw it out in the store when I was in there, and it's just excellent. The guitarist named Ben Monder, who's based in New York, I didn't realize he played on Black Star, the final Bowie album.
Oh man, that band is just so killer. That live jazz band that he had for Black Star, yeah, absolutely amazing. And I've listened to a lot of podcast interviews with those guys that they couldn't believe when they were playing a show and Bowie came in. Next thing they knew, they got a phone call to be the band. And a lot of times you hear about pop artists, they do a lot of takes, they take forever, and jazz guys can come and kill it on the first take. But they all said Bowie was just like them. He recorded live in the room with them, and just every take was good.
Well, he had a lifetime of doing this, and he knew what he was going to do.
Yeah, even when he was dying of cancer, his voice was still great. Let's move on to the next question. I would like to ask you this. What is the most challenging song a student ever brought to you to learn? I would say with me, I think you remember this when I used to teach at House Guitars. I had a student that all he wanted to learn is Dream Theater. And I was like, oh my God. And so it took me a lot of work to learn it first and then teach it to him. And then one of the hardest ones ever was Rosanna by Toto. That's a really challenging song. How about you, guitar-wise? What is the most challenging song ever brought to you?
That's a weird one to think of, because I mean, as I say, I've been doing this for 27 years, and I've gone over it with so many people. I mean, I've usually been the one trying to get some teenagers to play things like certain parts of Rush songs or King Crimson songs, which normally they're of course not as familiar with. I mean, at this point, kids know Rush more, but when I started teaching, no one wanted to know them.
Maybe this will trigger your brain. I'm noticing, I don't know about you, but so I have middle school kids now. They are all into grunge music. Some of it, like Nirvana, can be challenging for the drummer because of the endurance, because Dave Grohl can play like a machine really quickly. But you bring in something like Soundgarden Spoon Man, that's pretty tricky because it's a complex part and it's not all in 4/4.
Actually, I will say, and this isn't me teaching it, but in 2013, I was working on an acoustic set to play up around Hilton, New York, closer to the lake. We were with myself and someone who sings and plays guitar. We were going to be performing just on an afternoon. We were working on Fell on Black days.
Yeah.
And I really, and he was able to sing it, but when I was messing up the rhythm, because I've always had a fairly good sense of rhythm, but obviously some rhythms are just going to make you want to slap the person. And clearly when Chris Cornell wrote that, he felt what he felt. He knew what he was doing. He developed it. So when we were working on it together, I was making certain mistakes because of the rhythm of it. And I really felt bad because it's like, yeah, that means he just has to keep singing that part, which is pretty much at the end of his reign. So it's like, yeah, I mean, obviously that wasn't me teaching it to somebody.
Right.
But the thing about that is that in teaching anything difficult or ostensibly difficult, I'm a big fan of just tearing the things apart. And I mean, just to look at what are we doing with this one beat? Where are we placing the 16th note pattern? I mean,
no, I think that's great because with drummers, a lot of times they're very simple, the songs we're doing for a while. And then one of the songs I always bring out is Come Together by the Beatles, not because it's really hard, but it's such an abstract, weird beat. And I do the same thing as you. I say, okay, there's 4 different beats in this song. Let's learn the first one and then the second one. And that first one with the triplets that for the intro of the song, a lot of times that throws them. So I go, okay, let's break this one rhythm into 4 parts. Play the beginning, play the middle, play the end, and then we put it together. It sounds like that's what you're doing with some students too.
Yeah, I mean, obviously guitarists are notorious for having a bad sense of rhythm or certainly not reading rhythm. The joke about how do you get a horn player to stop playing, take their music away. How do you get a horn player to stop playing, put music in front of them?
Oh.
And it's the sort of thing where...
3 musicians and a drummer.
Well, or that kind of thing. I mean, I normally would try to have people be aware rhythmically because, the amount of, especially if someone's already been playing and they say, I don't know music theory, they're a little afraid of it, and it's sort of, hang on. Well, reading rhythms can be falling under the umbrella of music theory. So if we learn how to read these just for simple strumming, you're already going to be a little ahead of the game because I think of many good guitar players, maybe a name or two that we both know, would be regarded as a good player, but it's sort of, if you're jamming with them, and there's no drummer to set the tempo and the time, it's kind of like, oh, we've just jammed for 3 hours and he played the same rhythm at the same tempo for 3 hours because that he's just fixated on soloing and not actually playing a part that's rhythmic. So
right, and you also, as a guitar teacher, as opposed to me as a drum set private teacher, you have to deal with rhythm and pitch. I'm just dealing with rhythm. I mean, obviously, my students are using 4 limbs and yours are using 2. I can see what you're saying because when I teach ukulele to 25 to 30 kids at the same time, which is pretty challenging. A lot of times I have to stop the song we're doing because the rhythm is a mess. So I do some rhythm exercises and then we get back to playing the chords right.
Yeah, like going through any method book. I mean, originally my thought was, I'm never going to use a method book. It's all cookie cutter, blah, blah, blah. But, early on, back in early 1999, I found that method books were very beneficial because it was big, it was glossy, and, the Hal Leonard books were always laid out nicely. And,
right.
And it's the sort of thing where, like in the guitar book, it brings up, it has you playing single notes, then it brings chords in like page 17 or something.
Yeah.
And all of the strumming is just quarter notes. And I always am very conscious to say it to anyone that at this part of the book, we're just playing down, where, the strum is down, because it's establishing a quarter note pulse, which is absolutely a necessary thing, of course. And then, because people, it's easy for humans, for all of us to want to kind of complicate something like, well, I can do more. It's like, you can, but you don't realize it sounds like a mess. Let's just get that quarter note pulse and then build out from there.
And I'm sure you've noticed this before. A lot of musicians that you and I appreciate their music, as they get older, just like a writer of a book, you learn how to express yourself more simply than when you're younger and flashy. I mean, a good example I always bring up in this podcast is Steve Gadd. I've been lucky enough to see him play so often. And yeah, he can play flashy like he always has, but the thing that always blows me away is when he plays simple, and it's such a tight groove that everybody in the club starts to clap to. I don't know what it is. I mean, it's magical what he does. And the other one I think of is I just saw the Beat Tour show with, it's, the 80s Crimson. And one of the things that really impressed me is not only did Steve Vai learn all the Fripp parts, I'm trying to think of a song. What are the two? There's Nuages, the instrumental ones with Fripp, and then there's one on Discipline. What's the instrumental track where Fripp plays in the higher range?
Sheltering Sky?
Yes, Sheltering Sky. Steve, known for being a flashy guy and can play his way around anybody and be on stage with Frank Zappa. When he played Sheltering Sky, it was so absolutely beautiful. The tone of his guitar, the fact that he didn't do anything extra, he just played that simple melody beautifully, and it really brought down the house. And, for a band that is doing all kinds of crazy stuff, with Danny Carey on drums, it was so cool to be impressed by that just as much as people playing in every odd time signature there is.
That reminds me of the video that was going around this summer of Tony Levin back in around 1962 with Mangione's band.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Tony was just playing this monster bass solo, and most of us know him from Peter Gabriel Forward,
right,
as far as the guy who's laid back. He's pulling back on the beat a little bit.
Yeah.
He's, the idea of Tony saying, with Elephant Talk, he never was the guy who began an album. Or with Don't Give Up, I think, the bass riff that begins that for Peter Gabriel.
Yeah.
Tony being so restrained, but you look back in, the early 70s, and he was just destroying that thing. Maturity.
Yeah, and I don't think it's only that because, I still love a lot of complicated music, as I mentioned, Frank Zappa, people like that. But I think the ability, and I often tell my students this, to play well, whether you're being loud or quiet or busy or simple, it's still all in your execution and becoming masterful at doing that. And like you said, being able to handle a situation where you make a mistake and still make it work.
Well, one thing I'd want to bring up, too, is the concept of the rest.
God forbid.
Some books you would buy might refer to a rest in music the way that too many musicians refer to it as a quote-unquote pause. And it's the sort of thing where, again, I referenced the one Hal Leonard method book, where they actually, when they address a rest, they refer to it as silence in music.
Yeah. And
that's something that people like Robert Fripp has talked about many times, and there are many Guitarcraft aphorisms that speak to that. But the idea there that, as far as rhythm goes, you're not playing for four measures. You're not playing on the and of three. Well, that is still present. It's still there. The music's moving forward. You are involved with the music. You're just allowing yourself to not just make noise or play a note. You're there to be present in that silence, and then you begin again. There are a lot of, there's certain jokes about that. I came across a video or an image I put on Facebook however many years ago that was a page of music that just was all rests for whatever instrument it was. And the comment was, take the night off. But
or it's a John Cage piece.
Right, yeah, exactly.
I think that extends, though, to other types of art, too. Like, if you learn how to do acting, even though you're not doing a line, you should be present and reacting to whoever is speaking.
And certainly with actors, if you're on stage or on film, you can have the raised eyebrow or the head tilt. It doesn't have to be delivering a line or even moving your hand. It can just be the look.
Yeah. Let's move on a little bit to photography, because I want to make sure that we get to cover this. When did you first develop an interest in taking photos?
That would be June of 1983. My father.
Are you sure about that?
My father purchased a Kodak Instamatic in the mid-'60s. It was always there. And basically, the time that I'm uncertain of is when my father bought a Konica SLR, whether that was in 83 or 82. So the Kodak just sat on his desk for months. And at some point towards the end of that school year, I just thought, I should use this. So, and that camera used 126 film.
Wait, so you were, I don't know if we're exactly the same age. What were you, around 13 in 83?
No, this was like right around my 12th birthday.
Okay, continue.
Yeah, the end of sixth grade. I think one of the first places I actually probably was photographing things was around, I think my parents and I went to Widmer Winery in Naples, New York, which is no longer Widmer. It's a totally different company, of course, because that was 40 years ago. But the camera used 126 size film cartridges. So they were, for a kid, easy to load. I just went to the drugstore downtown and would buy just a 12 or 24 exposure of film, and you just pop it in and take it back to the drugstore. So they were square negatives giving you square prints. So
it was a different time.
Yes. Way before Instagram, but they were still square.
Now, I've got to ask you this because both of us have been lucky to be alive in a time of great change technology-wise, whether you believe it's the singularity or not. But I've got to ask you, what do you prefer when you're taking photos these days? Film, digital photography? Do you still use a dark room? And do you ever use Photoshop to edit your photos?
Well, I have 3 cameras in here with film in them, but I haven't touched them, and other than to maybe pick a couple of them up, I haven't used them since before the pandemic began. Digital, obviously film offers a greater sense of legitimacy, especially if you're looking at it from an artistic standpoint, especially if I did work in the darkroom in high school and a little bit in the 90s when I had access in a local college. Digital is immediate, it's contemporary, it's the vernacular, and the classes I teach are more digital based. I actually do have a private lesson right now with someone who's using his iPhone. He has a 14, so he's committed to his phone. So
you can make a great video or a movie these days, or a TV show on a phone. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, there's a band out of Buffalo whose name I absolutely can't remember that I think their singer shot 2 or 3 videos on her iPhone, a few years ago. Photoshop I do use. I actually am scheduled to teach a Photoshop class that probably isn't going to happen because I don't think there's enough enrollment. I like Lightroom, which Adobe offers Lightroom and Photoshop together as a package. I feel like there's certain things I can do in Lightroom, like burning and dodging, that I don't do as well in Photoshop. But I do use Photoshop basically every day. Right before we began this, I was cropping down an image of Alex Lifeson to put on this one Rush thing that I post to online, because my day is Sunday to post, so I have to put something up tonight and have them approve it. So I was cropping down a photo of Alex Lifeson to make a snappy comment for tomorrow.
Yeah, I have Photoshop, and I used to use it all the time, especially when I was doing a lot of websites. But I have found I can almost do all the editing I need on my phone now, which is good in some ways and sad. But, things change. I wanted to ask you, who are some of your photography inspirations? We've got people like Ansel Adams that do these big mountains. We got Joel Peter Whitkin that does very bizarre stuff. Annie Leibovitz, which is more personalities. Who inspires you?
I would say the people that I go to that I could think of in my head and would speak of in class. Michael Kenna, he's a British photographer who's about to turn 71, based out of Seattle. He does, I have a couple of his books. One of them is titled Forms of Japan. He'll go to Hokkaido in the winter and get long exposure, hours of exposure overnight. Some of his images are very zen, which it's fitting that he I'm sure intentionally going to the North Island of Japan when it's covered in snow. Another photographer I discovered however many years ago, Todd Hido, Hido. He's from Ohio originally, based in Oakland. He takes he gets some disturbing images, but not disturbing, not in the Whitkin fashion.
All I'm going to say about Whitkin is, in case kids are listening, look that one up by yourself. But go on. Yeah,
I will say, as someone who's been chronologically an adult for decades, I'm not inclined to seek out Whitkin's work. Haven't seen it in the 90s in a book. It's just no, not for me. Hido's stuff is one example of Hido's stuff. He had a book called House Hunting, where he would go through a neighborhood and photograph a house. He'd find the right angle, or the correct angle, I should say, not right angle. And yeah, thank you. It's in the dark. There's no people, there's no one on the streets, and maybe a couple of lights around. So there's just this mood. And one of his images, I think the cover of the book was used for the album cover for the band Silver Sun Pickups.
Okay.
Their album, I think The Woods, from about 20 years ago, had that on the cover. I like Tatsuo Suzuki, Tatsuo, separate word, Suzuki, like the motorcycle.
Okay.
Obviously, a Japanese street photographer. He gets some interesting street portraits where he would use a flash while being out in the dark in the night, and he gets a certain gritty vibe. It's smooth and mod, but it's there's a certain vibe he gets doing that. And
so you're saying there's like a really good texture to his work?
No, I know. I was thinking I shouldn't say that, because when I say that, it makes me think of Anton Corbijn, who we might know from working with Depeche Mode and REM.
Love his work, and also he made that great movie Control.
He of course, his first big image was the Joy Division shot.
Yes.
When Ian Curtis turned around as they were walking into the tube in London, which Corbijn's work is gritty, grainy.
Yeah. Because
of, as you said, he could only afford to buy like a certain amount of film, so he would always buy a high ISO film, like 1600 or something, because he was in club.
I didn't know that.
So he just developed his style by using high-speed film and just accepting the graininess of it.
It's interesting because his work has such an ethereal, magical quality to it, and I think some of the best photos he ever took are on the Peter Murphy album, Holy Smoke. Those are just astounding and otherworldly. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that you gotta love, is that when a lot of those, for me at least, those things kind of come together, where it's sort of, you get those nice, those solid photos on a good album, and it's just a total package at that point. Let me ask you about teaching photography comparably to teaching music. Is it different, or what's that like for you, and how do you use your creativity when you're trying to reach students and bring out the most of them? Well, for a lot of it, in both settings, I'm inclined to be conscious about having a performative sensibility to reach people. For photography, as I say, the mainstay of my life in music instruction has been private lessons mostly, whereas for photography, it defaults to classes. And the class could be 2 people, 2-3 people. Yeah. Could be 6 or 10, because it's in as I say, it's in an art center, what used to be the Genesee Co-op way back in the day. And so at that point, it's me talking to a small collection of people who they themselves didn't know each other, and they don't know me. So there is a sense of being aware of, like I say, how universal can I be? And at this point, the concept of diversity and equity and inclusion, in many cases, it's an aspiration, and for many people in our culture, it's meant as it's a negative term, sadly for some people, or I should say many people. But I mean, just as a general rule or a general guideline, it's kind of like, I have someone coming in front of me who wants to learn something I'm involved with. Of course, I'm going to teach them, and regardless of age and race and gender and all that. And at that point, as I say, it's incumbent on me as the teacher to, and this is where I'm saying, be universal enough. I'm not adopting some dialect that isn't me. I'm certainly not throwing out profanity. One thing I've always admired about you is you're very observational, and you take time to respond, but I feel like you're really taking in the whole scene. So that must be integral to your teaching approach. Yeah, I was actually thinking about that last night, as far as with the individuals in the class that I would be inclined to want to be aware of each person. And obviously, it's not the easiest if you have a class, a collection, if you have half a dozen people in front of you. I can remember their names, and I could remember what they look like. But, after I ask them to tell the class about themselves and what brought them there, it's kind of like, all right, I got to make sure I do remember
because I would want to be, that invested and personal and personable with someone. Kind of like what's been said, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And to that end, some of those kind of sayings, people can speak to a definition of love or a trait of love being attention.
Right.
So at that point, I do have my attention in the room. I have my attention on what's being said. And if for any reason I do try to come at it from that fairly altruistic fashion. But at the same time, too, I will recognize that I also want to make sure I'm not standing there looking like an idiot in front of 6 people. So
I'm guilty of that once in a while.
That's where I think of how basically I'm improvising a lot of what I say in a lot of classes or guitar lessons, and I'm not saying this as like some admission of I am prepared. I'm prepared with my syllabus or my curriculum. I'm prepared with how I've been teaching. I have obviously a half a lifetime of experience teaching people. So, I have the experience to let things be open to how the individuals in the room will shape the class. And one of the things, and I won't be able to nail this quote, and I know I have it somewhere, a quote that Bill Bruford made in his instructional video from 1982, where, he was talking about how, what we have to say, and in that case about drums, but what he, would have to say might just simply be the 12 years that he had been playing drums to that point, which obviously he'd been playing longer, by 1982. But that's one of the things to think of is the principle of what Bill Bruford, honorary doctorate, who's come out of retirement again because he's that good. Yeah. What he was saying, just the words of wisdom of, that stayed with me, just the idea that, who we are as a person and how we approach our work, our, dare I say, craft, will come through in what we're doing and how we're doing it. And as I say, for me, it is about having a preparedness, but a sense of, like I say, attention to the room, to the situation.
I think that's really important because actually, before I talked to you, I was eating lunch and I was watching an old interview with Joe Pesci, and he was talking about how he really got his start in the movie business. I guess Scorsese and De Niro saw him in an earlier movie he did, and they asked him, they called him up and said, "Hey, we're interested in having you be in a movie we're making." He goes, "You know what? There's just a lot of luck involved, but if I wasn't prepared, I wouldn't have gotten the part."
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, I've got 2 more questions for you. One's a really easy, quick one. The other one is seismic. So let's go with the easy one first. Where can we hear music of yours, and also where can we see some of your photography?
Music, the music of me is kind of a difficult one because of the fact that I've always just basically played with other people and haven't really put together a lot of my own stuff. I mean, oddly enough, the closest someone could get to hearing recent music of me is, that I was populating my YouTube page with some chord progressions that are in the other tuning in which I play. I was doing this last spring and sending it specifically the links to some people through Guitarcraft I've been working with to say, hey, this is what I was talking about as far as the modes went. Which those are videos that are like, a minute long of me just playing a chord progression. So it's a little ridiculous to say it like that, because it's like, well, it's not a song.
Well, hey, I've got to mention, you did a great job on my solo album, Reanimation, which is on Spotify now. I was listening this morning. You did such an incredible job on that song, The Cloud. So I recommend people check that out.
Well, also, I've recently been listening while in the car to some of the stuff we recorded 30 years ago in February of 95, and then 29 years ago in September, October of 95, because I would, listen to certain songs that, after a certain amount of time had passed would stand out to me and would just think, all right, who has the tapes? Does Kelvin have those? Does Brian have those?
I think we all do have a little bit here and there.
Because I was just thinking, I was like, could we remaster these or something?
Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing. We did so much. We should get together and figure that out and do it. But for people that don't know, my solo album, Reanimation, the bulk of the album is me on drums, Alex on guitar and Tony Levin on bass. So yeah, he did an incredible job with that. So I know you have a YouTube channel for your music, but that's mostly for lessons, correct?
Yeah, it's kind of defaulted into that. I mean, there are videos of me playing with the League of Crafty Guitarists from
cool.
Atlanta in 2003. So some of the videos people would have to dig in a little bit, but I think some of them might be somewhat viewable. I mean, it's two different performances, and I individualize in converting from a VHS and then converting from a DVD. I separated the songs so people could seek out individual songs and, invest 3 minutes of their life to check something out. So me on YouTube is the place to catch me musically. But for photos, I've been using Instagram as kind of as a portfolio. For the most part, I'm not really inclined to look at Instagram as social media, even though it kind of arranged itself to be that now.
Yeah.
I didn't have a website. I did pay into a WordPress for alexkelleyphotography.com.
And that's still up?
Yeah, it's up. I mean, I can't say I did the best job of web design, but it's there and does have a few images that I felt like I should just post that were a little more modern, a little more current.
In your defense, as somebody who used to do websites a lot, WordPress is very complex. The way it works. If you're putting something together, Wix and Squarespace are a lot easier.
Yeah, I was kind of eyeballing Squarespace. I might go there if I do a guitar page, which I do have a guitar page up, but it's a free WordPress that came together well enough. But yeah, I definitely see how why so many people do promote Squarespace.
I'm going to read you a rather long passage from one of my new favorite books. It's called The Death of the Artist by William Dershowitz. The full title is The Death of the Artist: How Creators Are Struggling to Survive in the Age of the Billionaires and Big Tech. I haven't quite finished the book, but what I gather so far is what this book is saying is a lot of people your age and my age and, even a little bit younger or older, they're all saying, the music business is shot, the acting business is over, blah, blah, blah. We can't make the money we used to make back in the day. It's all over. And then people, including myself, have these discussions. Well, we're just making the art for the sake of making the art, which is true. But this book says, it kind of supports both sides. It says, yes, these industries for creative people are not what they used to be, but they are different now, and people are still making money. You just have to learn how to adapt. Before I read this quote, can you see what I'm saying there?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Another way to understand this idea that the arts are ecosystems is to recognize that money circulates within artistic communities. I saw this again and again. When you give artists money, they not only use it to make more art, they use it to help others make art. When she gets a little money in her PayPal account, Sam has told me, she'll turn around and buy an album. Many of the supporters of Patreon, both Lucy Bellwood and Monica Byrne remarked, are fellow struggling artists. The principle applies at larger scales as well. Ani DeFranco created a label, Righteous Babe, to release her own recordings, but she went on to release the work of many other artists too. Robert Rauschenberg and Andy Warhol both established foundations that support the arts. Mikhail Baryshnikov and Mark Morris both established art centers. But if there isn't money, there isn't anything to circulate. The music business now, Gibbs said, and this is true, of course, of other arts, is based on starving the plankton so that the whales can survive. Righteous Babe no longer carries other artists. In the age of piracy and streaming, DeFranco's own recordings do not generate sufficient profit. I'm from the generation before hip-hop was even called hip-hop, Gibbs told me. Wasn't no industry putting no money in there. There was no industry. We made the industry. But the way the music business is situated now, he said, hip-hop wouldn't have happened. The way people were making money then, it would be impossible because of the platforms. The only thriving scenes he sees are corporate ones like K-pop, since that's where all the money is. Now, if you go down a couple paragraphs, they kind of flip the coin and they say, some of the people I spoke with believe that the solution for the arts is better public funding. Others think we need a universal basic income. These may be both good ideas, but I don't think they would solve the problem either. We definitely need to do a better job, a much better job of funding the arts in this country. A number of musicians told me that they're able to survive at all only because of the fees from performing in Europe, specifically at events that exist thanks to public support. Everybody knows that funding for the arts is higher there than it is over here, but I'm not sure they understand quite how much higher. As of 2017, average public arts support across European Union came to 0.4% of the GDP, more than 60 times the level of the United States. At that rate, we would spend about $86 billion. So I think we can see from that excerpt, it's a pretty complex situation we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in some ways, some of these situations don't have to be as complex or complicated as they become or people want them to be. I could filibuster for, a long time on politics, and I absolutely 1,000% support a universal basic income.
Yeah.
Because stop and think about where money, you just, if someone wanted to be honest and real and look at where the money has gone over the last, 20 years or since the century began, you could sort of say how much money was spent, specifically in, Iraq, Afghanistan, how much money, and at that point it does cross political lines. I mean, people can say this party, that party. I mean, the Republicans have usually been a very pro-military party, but the Biden administration gave way more money to the Pentagon than they asked for. Yeah. I mean, it's a machine that's, and it's undeniable at this point when you look at, certainly our issues with housing in the U.S. and outside the U.S. too. Right. But it's undeniable that so much culture, so much of what makes a culture, so much of it's being brutalized and eliminated in favor of corporate. The rise of the corporation, as far as not just a rise of, but the idea that the corporations are just consuming so much. And you stop and think that the amount of individuals. I remember working at in the 90s with some kid who was saying that he didn't had the talking point of, I don't want my money going to the National Endowment for the Arts. And and it's like the amount that our government spends on the arts. I mean, as you read there, I mean, the EU spends 0.04 of the GDP, and 60 times more than the United States would spend. It's like the amount of money that our culture puts into the arts, and it is the sort of thing where. The question is, what's our purpose? What's the raison d'etre? Why are we here? It's not just because we're here, Rush reference, but it's the sort of thing where, theoretically, it's the arts. It's it is, and by that arts, I mean, obviously, I'm speaking to visual and music, but certainly acting, certainly writing, that makes a culture the culture. I mean, we're not all supposed to be Sparta. And we're not all supposed to be just a tiny cog in a machine that causes people who live in, $78 million compounds to enjoy the arts that they wound up amassing, basically. Right. By saying what I'm saying, it's like clearly this could branch off into hours of discussion because. Yes, you are correct. It is a complicated issue. I think back to one of the classes I had at the end of my master's degree. It was a class in transformative education, and that fell under the adult education department, for lack of a better term, because there is a degree in adult education that exists. And it looked at the works of Jacques Mesereau and Paulo Freire. Some reading by bell hooks, and these are all educators, writers, pundits who spoke to what I view as the reality of our existence and how we treat other people, how we treat ourselves, and that's something I was talking about a couple of weeks ago in another online meeting. Guitarcraft based, where if people think I'll treat people as you would have them treat yourself, whether it's someone who's saying that in general, whether it is a biblical quote, I believe in Matthew, the idea there is that, well, people don't know how to treat themselves. We treat ourselves horribly.
Yeah.
And we can first and foremost use that as a justification that it's sort of, well, I'm gonna be obnoxious over here, but I rail on myself more. It's like, well, here's an idea: don't rail on yourself and give yourself attitude, and then ask for what you would want for yourself to be there for the other people, and then. Now here we are, if anyone's listened this long to me rambling on, a set of terms in our political system or political systems that some people would want to view as negative or, we don't want to go that way. But it's like, well, a lot of Latin American countries voted that way because they recognize that it's better for humans to live human lives supporting each other. Because if you have 8 billion people on a rock floating in space, why intentionally make someone's life worse? That kind of thing. I mean, that's you're right. It is a complicated. I'm not even saying complex. I'm saying complicated because just the principle that complex might be complex. If you're playing, if someone's playing a 17/8 figure and a couple other people are playing 5/4 and that might be a complex polyrhythm to deal with. But if you're basically looking at the U.S. government, complicated equates to a mess. And it's frustrating that I would say in our lifetimes it won't be solved.
Yeah.
Because it would be nice to see the results, to feel and experience the results, not even just see it, but the idea that the arts are necessary to make lives better. And, like the thing I found last week on Facebook that I threw out there as far as the whole, all right, well, you don't care about the arts, make sure you don't listen to any music this week, don't watch any TV, don't do this. And while we're at it, actually some of the things that are in our homes are designed by designers, and the sleek functioning of your stove or your car, a designer
any type of aesthetics,
Yeah.
And, any organization is not perfect, including the school I work at. However, there's a lot of great things. And one of the things that brings students and families to my school is because of our enrichment classes. We have a garden teacher, a cooking teacher, a music teacher, an art teacher, PE teachers. And, you can sit there and try to get the best score on all your STEM tests and things like that. But I think parents and students are realizing the value of having the arts. I often tell kids that are having behavioral issues in my class, I go, look, guys, I know private schools around here that don't have music class. You don't realize how lucky you are. I mean, when you and I grew up, it was pretty normal for a school to have a music program, but these days it's really, really rare. I don't know how it is upstate New York lately, but a lot of times, like private schools, I ask the kids, they often will hire me to teach their kids drums because there's no music program. So I'll say, well, what do you guys do at your school for music? And they almost always say, and this is mostly private schools, once a year, they all get their Orff instruments, they get their little marimbas and xylophones and glockenspiels, and each kid gets one part, that's dum, 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 and then another kid will be like, doot, 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 doot. That's what they do. Once a year, they have a holiday concert. And to just push everything aside and say, we'll just have a little bit for the holiday, I don't think is good enough, because I have seen the results of kids learning music, even kids that won't end up playing music when they're older. Think about how many surgeons also play an instrument, or somebody like Einstein. I think it's, not only integral to the focus of this podcast, but for everybody to be well-rounded by using the arts.
Well, that's something I've said to a lot of students over the years too. That I've often said, don't feel like you have to do this as a professional thing. It's like you can be a math teacher and play. You can be a school psychologist. You can be a cop. You can be a lawyer. And get together with other lawyers and just jam out. And
these are the people in our neighborhood, but go on.
Yes, and I would say that certainly learning the rock band instruments that are pretty consistent as far as drums and keyboard, bass, guitar. That's something I've said to various people and still would. I mean, I've had students who've done the professional route. Like one guy I used to teach is in Nashville, and he was driven and serious, and he plays all day in Nashville. And he's gone on some tours with I think like a lot of The Voice or America's Got Talent type of singers. But yeah, I mean, the multitude of people, it's like, and that's where when it comes to practice, if, you get the parent, oh, he didn't practice, or, oh, I didn't practice, like, that's fine.
I know, I always tell the parents, I go, look, 90% of my students, this lesson is the practice, so don't take it personally.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And that's the thing I always would want people to realize, that because people, certainly the stigma of, well, you should be practicing between lessons, like, well, maybe they should. Sure, that'd be awesome, but that's not necessarily.
They're 5. Come on, dude.
Oh, yeah, exactly. When you're talking about someone who's 5, this is just them. Yeah, I've usually used the Phantom Menace simile comparison of the idea of saying that, well, if someone's 5 or 6, they're basically just learning how to not have fear on the instrument, and it's just part of their life, as opposed to when you get an adult student and they're a little afraid, like, oh, it's like, no, it's cool. You don't have to, you're not here to impress me, you're just basically here to learn. Whereas a kid, they just walk in and do it, say, hey, can you play that? Oh, you didn't practice? I don't care. We're here to do this right now.
Well, the thing is, my father that passed away not long ago, he was a very successful lawyer. In fact, he was president of the bar of New York State. But what a lot of people don't know is he was in a barbershop quartet. And I'll never forget when I was a little kid seeing all these people come over once a week and gather around the piano and sing. And, that must have brought him some type of escape or relief from the madness of daily life and just fun, not making any money, but just enjoying it and collaborating with other people.
And that's the thing that you just mentioned, that we as a culture have to recognize that things that don't make or generate money for us or generate it for someone else are 100% perfectly acceptable, for the sense of sanity, for the sense of release, for the sense of just being there and pushing the culture forward in whatever way, shape, or form it's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think one way to wrap it up is, I'm not sure if you listened, but a few podcasts ago, I interviewed a good friend of mine here named Phil Circle. He's an interesting guy. He runs a music school here and another one in Chicago. And he's a teacher like us, and he also performs. And his argument is like, look, I don't care the state of the industry. If you really want your profession to be a professional musician, you can do it. You've got it, stop making excuses, stop saying the industry isn't what it used to be. You can do it. And here's a guy that does it. He runs 2 schools. He teaches, he performs, he makes all of his living as a musician. And so it doesn't matter what era you live in. I think, he said, don't make an excuse that I'm a right-brained person and I'm not good at business. He's like, no, do the work. Figure it out. You can do it. And I think you are very similar, because I've known you so long. I remember when you were, no offense to anybody that works at Home Depot, but I remember that wasn't your cup of tea. You didn't want to be there all day. You didn't want to be wearing the yellow shirt. And eventually you created this way to make enough money to survive. And I remember I was asking you one day, how's work going? And you go, it's not work, because you enjoy it. So how would you describe what you do instead of work?
Well, and that's, at this point, I'm willing to call it work in deference to the fact that effort and attention is part of it, and that it is how I make a living. But it does seem a disservice to call it work because of the fact that I do enjoy it. I mean, we usually associate work as a grind, something we have to do. I mean, so yeah, it is kind of a weird way to call it that. But as I say, I started to accept doing so just for the sake of it's how most people could relate to it, or as I say, just for the, one of the issues with the arts is that people would say, oh, you enjoy doing this, therefore you must want to do it for free. And it's kind of like,
it's like when you and I used to do a gig and it would be pay to play. You would have to pay to play the gig. Or if it was a gig with no pay, they would say something like, no, you don't understand. It is a privilege for you to play in my venue. And that's what's got to be turned around.
Yeah, I mean, that's where, you stop and think about the 1950s or early 60s, and people were hiring a band to be the entertainment in their bar, their restaurant, their club. And then at certain points in the 70s, things were turned around where it's sort of, oh, you want to be a star? You'll pay to be a star.
It's like that Bauhaus song.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Party of the company.
Oh, fine. We'll be back next year.
A drummer. So,
I mean, you're right, though. I mean, the people that say, and I don't care if I offend anybody, it's a privilege for you to play at our venue or, something like that. I mean, it's no different than a racket. It's, it's like a pathetic pyramid scheme that's invisible and the young, naive musician doesn't recognize it yet.
Yeah, that's where a few years ago when some people I was playing with, they wanted to play at the Fringe Fest, which is here every September, and most of the venues, depending on who you were, most of the venues were a pay-to-play situation. You essentially would rent it, you get the tickets, you sell the tickets, and it's sort of, and I brought that into a couple of people, and that sort of ended that, because it's like the bass player aspired to play at the Fringe Fest for years. And I said, this is pay to play.
Well, you know what? Listen, I mean, this goes back to what the book was saying. It's what's going on right now in the world. I mean, I'm sure you remember this too. I go to Subway or Starbucks, and immediately they're going to hand me the thing and say, I want you to answer questions. So we have to give a tip to people.
Yeah.
That, no offense, because, a lot of people I care about work at either of those places. But here's what infuriates me. People, the prices of things are raising up more and more to the point that, you go to the store and hummus is $8. People can't afford anything. And so instead of the companies paying more, someone must have said, well, wait a minute, let's make the consumer pay more. And so now they've added the tip on. And I say this in my defense because within the last year I went to a wedding in Sweden, and we were over there in Copenhagen, and my younger sister said to me, she said, when you're over there, don't tip anybody. And I was like, what? She's like, no, don't tip the people in the car, don't tip the people in the restaurant. And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, well, they actually pay people while they're.
Yeah.
And it's different. And so I don't know how it is in every country, but I can say from living here, it's getting ridiculous that we're not supporting the arts as much as we could. And that goes beyond to friends of mine that are actors. We had a big strike and they worked it out and they said the actors won. But now most of my friends that are pretty well-known actors, I would say like 60% of them are out of work because it seems like the industry said, okay, you need to be paid that much. Well, we're not going to really hire you as much.
Yeah, so that way basically it's the studio executives who are really getting all the pay.
Yeah, I mean, and all these people that are, just the middle, not just the middle class of people, but anybody that falls into the middle, you're either very poor or very rich, and we're just talking about the arts here, but, I've heard a lot of iconic performers that you and I like say, I'm really lucky that I made my money in the 80s and the 90s and that I'm an icon now because I don't know what I would do if I was a younger musician.
Yeah. The amount of bands that have had to break up because they couldn't afford to be a band because you make your money by touring now.
Or how about the other way around? A lot of our favorite players are in their 70s and they have to stay on tour to pay the bills because they're not making royalties anymore. You got a very private person like Tom Waits who wants to stay home with his wife and live a private life, and he used to live off of royalties, and I'm sure he still does fine because he does movies, but, at one point he said in an article, I may have to tour more because I'm not getting that revenue anymore.
Yeah, that was a guitarist, Dick Dale, who toured up until he died because he had medical bills, and he was saying that's all he could do and basically just pay for them by going back out on tour, and he was definitely up there. He was around 80 or so when he did die. But so he was touring at a point when he was just saying, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to stay positive and we have to recognize that the world is changing, but still, there's got to be a better way. Yeah,
and I do have faith, some bit of faith that, Gen Z, people that are in Caleb's grade or age range, that a lot of them who are beginning their lives as adults are saying this we don't have what was available and we need to change it. They don't have as much power, but they do have the youth and the vitality. But
they're also doing a lot of cool things. It was my students that got me back into vinyl because they started giving me records for Christmas and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, I need to buy a record player. But then I was realizing how great this is because I think the profit margin for an artist putting out vinyl is probably bigger than any other medium. So that's a hopeful situation.
Yeah, and that's where I made it a point to buy that CD a couple weeks ago or last week because I thought I'm going to buy it locally. Yeah. And it's a person who's not well known because it is a case of, like you were saying towards the beginning of this, as far as supporting other people who are in that realm. Basically, I'm not buying it through Amazon. This isn't someone who could throw the CD away because they're going to make $18 million on a tour. It's basically someone who played up here in front of a dozen people.
Yeah, and I just interviewed Tony Levin, and, he's been a friend of mine for 45 years, and although I could probably get a free copy, I'm going to buy his new album. It's just the principle of it that it's so difficult. A lot of people are printing out CDs, and it's basically just something to autograph.
Yes.
So anyway, I think we should wrap it up. We've gone way over because we always have a good time, but why don't I invite you back sometime soon for part 3?
Yeah, that works because there's always more to talk about.
All right, Alex Kelley, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you again soon.
That works. Thank you.
Thank you.